There are moments in history that arrive not as gradual shifts but as detonations, compressions of slow time into a single rupture, after which the world that existed before is simply gone. The California Gold Rush was one of those moments, but to understand the magnitude of what exploded on the morning of January 23rd, 4th, 1840, 8, you first have to understand the world that was about to be unmade. California in the autumn of 1840. 7 was not quite American. It was not quite Mexican anymore either. It existed in the specific uncertainty of a place whose political identity had not yet resolved, hovering between two civilizations, held in place by nothing more solid than a military occupation and the slow machinery of a peace treaty still being negotiated thousands of miles away. It was remote, thinly populated, and almost entirely unknown to the people who would soon flood into it by the hundreds of thousands. It was, in almost every sense, a world on the edge, geographically, politically, and historically. What it was not was empty, and the failure to reckon with that fact is one of the enduring distortions in the standard telling of the Gold Rush story. The deepest layer of California belonged to its indigenous peoples, and what they had built over thousands of years was extraordinary by any measure. California had been home, long before any European ship appeared on its horizon, to the most linguistically and culturally diverse indigenous population in all of North America. Estimates of the pre-contact population range from 150,000 to 300,000 people, speaking somewhere between 80 and 100 distinct languages, a density and diversity of human cultural life with no equivalent anywhere on the continent. These were not nomadic peoples drifting across empty territory. They were settled communities with established homelands, elaborate ritual and ceremonial lives, sophisticated material cultures, and political arrangements ranging from small band, level societies to more complex chieftainships in areas of particular ecological abundance. The oak woodlands, the coastal fisheries, the interior river systems running cold from the Sierra Nevada. California's landscape offered a sufficiency of food that allowed populations to be dense and sedentary in ways the harsher environments of the Great Plains simply did not permit. By 1847, this population had already been dramatically reduced by the epidemics that arrived with European contact and by the systematic destruction of the Spanish mission system. From whatever it had been at first encounter to perhaps 150,000 souls, diminished, damaged, but present, still living in their territories, still speaking their languages, still practicing their cultures in forms that 2 centuries of colonial pressure had wounded but not erased. This is the California that the gold rush would devastate, not a blank wilderness waiting to be filled, but a living world about to be overwhelmed. The second layer was Spanish and then Mexican, the Franciscan mission system, established beginning in 1769 and stretching from San Diego northward to Sonoma in a chain of 21 missions, each approximately a day's walk apart, had been the primary instrument of Spanish colonization for half a century. The missions were total institutions in the deepest sense, places that controlled every dimension of indigenous life within their walls, from sleeping hours to labor obligations to the language in which God could be addressed. They drew indigenous people in through a combination of inducement and compulsion, converted them to Christianity, put them to work in mission agriculture and crafts, and exposed them relentlessly to European diseases against which they had no biological defense, killing them in numbers that mission burial registers documented with grim bureaucratic precision. When the Mexican government secularized the missions in 1833, distributing their vast land holdings to private grantees, what followed was not liberation but transformation. The indigenous people who emerged from decades of mission confinement stepped into a world whose ecological and social foundations had been destroyed during their confinement. The ranchero families who received the mission grants replaced the Franciscans as the dominant landowners and employers of indigenous labor. By 1847, California's economy was fundamentally a cattle economy, enormous herds running on open range, hides and tallow produced for the maritime trade that connected California to the wider world through the ships of Boston merchants. A workforce that included indigenous Californians working in conditions that differed from the missions more in name than in substance. The rancheros were the aristocracy of Mexican California. Land, rich and cash, poor, presiding over a way of life that was already precarious long before anyone had heard of James Marshall or Sutter's Mill. The third layer was the thin, restless presence of recent American and European arrivals, men and women who had trickled into California through various routes across the preceding decade, drawn by land, by trade, by the specific frontier restlessness that the 19th century American imagination elevated into a kind of cultural virtue. Among them was John Sutter, a Swiss immigrant of grandiose ambition and elastic financial ethics, who had carved a small empire from the Sacramento Valley through Mexican land grants, indigenous labor, and the entrepreneurial audacity that frontier conditions rewarded and civilized places would not have tolerated. Sutter's fort on the Sacramento River was the nucleus of this empire, a hub of commerce and agricultural production, and the specific kind of frontier authority that exists only in the absence of any competing power. It was on Sutter's property, on the tail race of a sawmill being built on the American River at a place called Coloma, that a carpenter named James Marshall noticed something glinting in the water on a January morning and understood, in the way that certain moments announce themselves before the mind has time to process them rationally, that the world had just changed. Now, here is the crucial geopolitical coincidence. The timing's so extraordinary, it seems almost designed by someone with a taste for dramatic irony. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which formally ended the Mexican-American War and transferred California to the United States, was not signed until February 2nd, 1840, 9 days after Marshall's discovery. The war itself had begun in April 1840, triggered by a skirmish on the disputed border between Texas and Mexico, prosecuted under President Polk with a territorial ambition barely disguised as national self-defense, and challenged from the beginning by voices whose moral clarity time has vindicated. Congressman Abraham Lincoln, a first-term Whig from Illinois, demanded that Polk identify the precise spot on American soil where Mexican forces had allegedly drawn first blood. Henry David Thoreau went to jail rather than pay the taxes funding a war he condemned as unjust, and from that jail cell produced the essay on civil disobedience that would eventually shape the resistance philosophies of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Ulysses Grant, who served as a young officer in the conflict and would later command the Union armies, wrote in his memoirs that the Mexican-American War was one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker one. What the United States took by force was not empty land. It was California, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of what would become Colorado, Wyoming, Nevada, and Utah, territories that contained a substantial population of Mexican citizens whose property rights and civil rights the treaty promised to protect, and whose subsequent experience of American governance would become a systematic demonstration that promises extracted in a treaty of peace are only as durable as the political will of the victor to honor them. The California of 1840. 7. Indigenous. Spanish. Inflected. Mexican by legal inheritance, and now nominally American by military occupation, was a layered, living, complicated place, and it was already ending, quietly and irreversibly. In the months before the rest of the world knew that gold was waiting in its rivers, James Marshall was not a man history would have noticed had history not arranged to place him at exactly the right spot on exactly the right morning. He was a carpenter, competent, itinerant, the kind of skilled tradesman the frontier perpetually needed and perpetually underpaid. In the autumn of 1847, he was supervising the construction of a sawmill for John Sutter at a site called Coloma on the South Fork of the American River. roughly 50 miles east of Sutter's Fort in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The mill was a practical project. Nothing more. Sutter needed lumber. The forest above Coloma had lumber. And Marshall had the skills to build the mechanism that would convert one into the other. On the morning of January 24th, 1848, Marshall walked the mill race. The channel cut to direct water through the mill, and noticed something in the gravel at the bottom that caught the thin winter light. He picked it up. He turned it in his fingers. It was soft enough to bend slightly between his teeth, heavy in a way that gravel is not, and the colour was unmistakable even to a man who had never seen raw gold before. He knew, not with the measured certainty of the assayer or the geologist, but with the specific physical certainty of someone holding something real in their hand. He gathered several pieces and rode immediately to Sutter's Fort to show his employer what he had found. John Sutter's reaction to the news was not the jubilation that the mythology of gold discovery tends to project onto such moments. It was closer to dread. Sutter understood immediately and correctly that a gold discovery on his land would not make him rich. It would destroy everything he had spent a decade building. He tested the samples, consulted his encyclopedia on the properties of gold, and confirmed what Marshall already knew. Then he asked his workers to keep quiet, swore Marshall to secrecy, and rode to Coloma himself to assess the scale of what had been found. He was attempting, in other words, to do something that no force in human nature supports, to keep a secret about gold. The secrecy lasted approximately 6 weeks, which in retrospect seems generous. The workers at the mill knew. The workers told other workers. The other workers told travellers passing through. By March of 1848, enough people in the Sacramento Valley had heard rumours of the discovery that the information had effectively escaped containment. The specific mechanism by which it then escaped California entirely and became a global phenomenon was a man named Samuel Brannan, and Brannan deserves a longer pause than history typically gives him, because his role in the gold rush illuminates something essential about the relationship between information and wealth that the 19th century was only beginning to understand. Brannan was a newspaper publisher, a merchant, a Mormon elder who had broken with Brigham Young and was operating a store near Sutter's Fort that stood to profit enormously from any influx of miners needing supplies. He travelled to the gold fields, confirmed the discovery with his own eyes, stocked his store with every pick and shovel and pan and sack of flour he could acquire, and then travelled to San Francisco, where he walked the streets holding a vial of gold dust above his head and shouting that gold had been discovered on the American River. Within days, the population of San Francisco had largely abandoned the town for the Sierra Nevada foothills. Ships sat unmanned in the harbour. Shops closed mid. Business. The military governor of California reported to Washington with barely concealed alarm that he could not maintain order because his soldiers were deserting their posts at a rate that left his garrisons functionally empty. The ranchos went untended. The hide trade that had been the connective tissue of California's economy with the wider world collapsed because the labour force that produced the hides was now digging in the rivers. Samuel Brannan became one of the first millionaires of the gold rush without ever once bending over a stream with a pan in his hand, by selling necessities to desperate men at prices that reflected a perfect understanding of what a captive market would bear. His lesson, that the safest fortune in a gold rush belongs to the man who sells the shovels, was one that California's commercial class absorbed quickly and applied with remarkable creativity. The news that transformed a California event into a national and then a global rupture arrived through a specific and dramatically effective channel. President James K. Polk, a lame duck finishing his single term and preparing to hand power to Zachary Taylor, delivered his annual message to Congress on December 5th, 1848. The message covered the routine business of a nation, tariffs, foreign relations, the condition of the Treasury, but embedded within it was a paragraph about California that made everything else in the document irrelevant. Polk confirmed, with the full weight of presidential authority, that gold had been discovered in California in quantities sufficient to transform the expectations of all who heard it, and he arranged for a tea caddy containing 230 ounces of California gold to be placed on display at the War Department in Washington, where any citizen who wished to examine it could do so. The combination of presidential confirmation and physical evidence produced an effect that months of scattered newspaper reports and excited letters had not achieved. It converted the gold rush from a regional story circulating among those with California connections into a national obsession consuming every conversation in every parlor and tavern and church meeting from Boston to Street. Louis. The physical gold in its tea caddy was the crucial element. It could be seen, touched, and understood by people who had no framework for evaluating distant rumors, but every framework for evaluating something solid and yellow and heavy sitting in a case in front of them. What Polk's announcement released was not simply the desire for gold, though that was certainly present and powerful. It released something more specifically and characteristically American, the accumulated restlessness of a country that had just won a war, doubled its territory, and was vibrating with the expansionist confidence that the phrase manifest destiny had been coined to name. The men who began making their preparations in the first weeks of January 1840 were not, for the most part, desperate men with nothing to lose. Many of them were young men from the northeastern and midwestern United States who had something very specific to lose: farms, businesses, the beginnings of settled lives, families who needed them, and who found the specific combination of the gold rush's promise and the culture's loud encouragement simply irresistible. The gold rush offered the thing that the 19th century American imagination found most compelling above all others: the chance to remake yourself completely, to leave behind whatever circumstances you had been born into and emerge on the other side of a great journey as someone entirely different and, crucially, entirely better. It was the American dream rendered literal and geographical, a dream that pointed west, that required a journey to reach, and that promised transformation as the reward for endurance. California had become a word that meant something beyond itself. It meant possibility. It meant the future. It meant the specific, intoxicating idea that the life you were currently living was not the only life available to you, and that the distance between the life you had and the life you wanted could be measured in miles rather than in decades of patient accumulation. No rumor in American history had ever carried that message with quite such force, or to quite so many people, all at once. The decision to go to California was not made lightly, even by the men who made it impulsively. It required a reckoning with everything a person had built or was building: the farm that needed selling or mortgaging, the business left in a partner's uncertain hands, the money borrowed from family members who could not easily spare it. The simple act of walking away from whatever life one had been assembling in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Missouri or Georgia, it required equipping oneself for a journey whose length and difficulty most participants dramatically underestimated during the optimistic months of preparation. And it required saying goodbye to wives and parents and children with the specific weight that a departure toward a place most people had never heard of 2 years earlier imposed on everyone involved. The letters that 49ers wrote home before they left, and the letters that wives and mothers wrote in response, are some of the most emotionally honest documents in the American archive. They capture something. The promotional pamphlets and newspaper editorials of the period carefully avoided the fear underneath the excitement, the grief underneath the adventure, the awareness on both sides that the person leaving and the person staying might occupy entirely different worlds by the time they occupied the same room again. A farmer in Indiana selling his plough to buy passage west was not simply making an economic calculation. He was placing a bet with his entire life as the stake, in a game whose odds nobody could reliably calculate, toward a destination that existed in his imagination primarily as a collection of rumors and a government official's word and a tea caddy of gold sitting in a Washington building he would never visit. That is the emotional reality underneath the statistical enormity of the gold rush migration. Hundreds of thousands of individual acts of courage and recklessness and hope, each one carrying the specific weight of everything being left behind. The 3 routes to California were each remarkable in their own distinct way, and each attracted a different population shaped by geography, economics, and temperament. The Overland Trail. The California Trail branching off from the Oregon Trail at Fort Hall in present-day Idaho, stretched approximately 2,000 miles from the staging towns on the Missouri River westward, across the Great Plains, through the Rocky Mountains via South Pass, across the Nevada desert, and finally over the granite wall of the Sierra Nevada, in good conditions, with healthy animals and favorable weather and the near constant good luck that the trail demanded. The journey took approximately 5 months. The staging towns themselves: Independence, St. Joseph, Westport, Council Bluffs, filled in the late winter and early spring of 1840. 9 with an extraordinary concentration of humanity and livestock and ambition, all waiting for the prairie grass to grow tall enough in late April to sustain the animals that would pull the wagons westward. The timing of departure was one of the trail's most unforgiving constraints. Leave too early and the animals would starve on sparse spring grass before reaching the mountains. Leave too late and the Sierra Nevada passes would close under October snow. And the fate of the Donner Party, still raw in the national memory just 2 years after its catastrophe, would become not a cautionary tale but a personal possibility. The overland route was primarily the choice of farming families and agricultural communities from the Midwest and the Upper South. People who had wagons and oxen and the organizational habits of the agricultural frontier, and who understood implicitly how to manage the practical demands of a long journey through difficult terrain. It was the cheapest route in cash, though the most expensive in physical endurance, and the one that produced the most vivid diaries and letters of the entire migration. Because 5 months of sustained hardship gives a person a great deal to write about. The sea route around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America, was approximately 18,000 miles from the eastern seaboard and took between 5 and 8 months aboard the sailing ships and the newer steam assisted vessels that increasingly made the run. It was primarily the route of New Englanders and city dwellers from the eastern seaboard, men more comfortable with maritime life and able to afford the passage fare, which ranged from $100 to $300 depending on the vessel and the class of accommodation. The Cape Horn experience oscillated between extended monotony and acute terror in proportions that depended heavily on the season and the weather. The months of sailing down the Atlantic through the tropics were primarily an exercise in boredom and bad food, and the slow deterioration of human patience in close quarters. The rounding of Cape Horn itself was something else entirely. The ferocious winds of the Southern Ocean, the enormous swells that could dwarf a fully rigged ship, the cold that numbed hands and stripped away any romantic attachment to maritime adventure. Sailors who had made the passage before spoke of it with a specific respect that the uninitiated tended to mistake for exaggeration until they experienced it themselves. Vessels that survived the Horn then faced the long Pacific Passage northward to San Francisco, arriving months after departure in a harbour so crowded with ships that vessels sometimes had to anchor in the bay for weeks waiting for a berth. The intermediate route across Panama offered a theoretical speed advantage over either of the other two, crossing the isthmus on foot and by dugout canoe through 40 miles of jungle before boarding a Pacific coast vessel northward to California. Businessmen and politicians and professional men who needed to reach California before the best commercial opportunities were claimed chose Panama for its relative brevity, and paid for that speed in the specific currency that the Panamanian jungle extracted from everyone who passed through it: malaria, cholera, and yellow fever, offered with the cheerful impartiality of a landscape indifferent to human ambition. The jungle crossing itself was genuinely harrowing. Mud and heat and insects, and the permanent uncertainty of when the next Pacific steamer would appear on the western shore. Men sometimes waited weeks in the pestilential port of Panama City for a vessel that had been promised and had not arrived, watching their companions fall ill around them and calculating with increasing anxiety the cost of the time they were losing. Together, these 3 streams of migration produced the largest single year influx of people into any territory in American history. The non-indigenous population of California went from perhaps 14,000 people at the beginning of 1840, to approximately 100,000 by the end of 1849, a multiplication of roughly 30 times in under 2 years that transformed every assumption about what California was or could be, and set in motion consequences that no one involved in the migration had the perspective to fully anticipate. They were arriving at the edge of a continent they barely knew, carrying everything they owned and everything they hoped, stepping into a world that would prove simultaneously more difficult and more astonishing than anything the promotional literature had managed to convey. The overland experience began not on the trail itself, but in the staging towns on the Missouri River. And the staging towns in the spring of 1840. 9 were themselves a spectacle unlike anything most of their temporary inhabitants had previously encountered. Independence and St. Joseph and Council Bluffs filled from February onward with wagons and oxen and horses and mules and the men who owned them, creating impromptu cities of canvas and livestock that stretched for miles along the riverbank, humming with the specific energy of people who have committed to something enormous and are now living in the anxious interval between the decision and the departure. The smell alone, thousands of animals confined in a small area, their feed and their waste and the mud churned by their hooves, was something that the diaries of the period record with a consistency that suggests it was genuinely memorable. Wagon trains organised themselves into companies before departure, electing captains and writing constitutions and establishing rules for the governance of the train with the democratic seriousness that the American frontier culture brought to every collective enterprise. These constitutions were earnest documents, carefully negotiated among men who had never met before February and who would be living in each other's company for 5 months. They established procedures for resolving disputes, allocated responsibilities for camp, making and animal care, set rules for the pace of travel and the length of the daily rest. Then the trail tested every provision, and the trail's judgment of human. Made arrangements was characteristically unsentimental. Captains were deposed, constitutions were amended or abandoned. Companies split and reformed along lines of compatibility and conflict that the stress of the journey revealed with a clarity that ordinary life tends to conceal. The physical landscape through which the trail passed changed so dramatically over the course of the journey that travellers sometimes felt they were moving through several different worlds in sequence, each one stranger and more demanding than the last. The rolling green prairies of Missouri and Kansas gave way to the drier, short, grass plains of Nebraska, the horizon expanding and the sky becoming enormous in ways that many immigrants found simultaneously beautiful and disorienting. After a lifetime among the enclosed horizons of eastern woodlands, the Platte River, which the trail followed for hundreds of miles across Nebraska, was one of the great landmarks of the overland experience, broad and shallow and braided across its sandy bed, essentially undrinkable from its alkaline content, but providing the flat terrain and the reliable westward direction that the trail needed. Travellers described the Platte with a mixture of gratitude and contempt that captures its character precisely. Too wide to ignore, too shallow to be useful, too alkaline to drink, but pointing west with an unwavering consistency that a traveller 500 miles from the nearest landmark could genuinely appreciate. The great geological landmarks accumulated as the miles increased, chimney rock rising, improbably from the Nebraska plain, like something from a different continent. Scott's Bluff, the Black Hills, the Rocky Mountains resolving from a smear on the horizon into a physical reality of stone and snow. South Pass, the broad, gentle saddle through the Continental Divide that was the topographical key to the entire overland route, surprised most travellers with its mildness. They had expected a dramatic mountain crossing, and found instead a wide, elevated plain, whose summit was almost impossible to identify with certainty. Then the descent into the Great Basin, and the Nevada desert, which was where the trail truly revealed its capacity for cruelty. The 40-mile desert between the Humboldt Sink and the Carson River was the crossing that broke many parties. Water was scarce and brutally rationed. The sun was merciless. The carcasses of animals and the wreckage of abandoned wagons from earlier parties lined the trail in a display of previous suffering that those currently suffering found simultaneously instructive and demoralizing. Men threw everything that could be spared from the wagons to lighten the load on failing animals. Furniture, extra clothing, books, the accumulated domestic objects that families had packed with such care in Missouri and that the desert revealed to be incompatible with survival. The trail was littered with these objects, the material evidence of optimism revised downward by reality. The cholera that swept through the overland immigration of 1840. 9 was the trail's most devastating single catastrophe, killing perhaps 5,000 people along the route that year in an outbreak that followed the specific vector of contaminated water sources at the camping spots where thousands of travelers stopped in sequence. Cholera moved with terrible speed. A person healthy at breakfast could be dead by nightfall. The disease working through the body with a violence that left survivors shaken in ways that the trail's other hardships did not. The specific cruelty of cholera on the overland trail was not only the dying itself, but the circumstances in which it occurred. Far from any medical care. In the company of people who were themselves frightened and exhausted. With the practical demands of the journey continuing regardless of grief, a man could bury his travelling companion in the morning and be required by circumstances to hitch the oxen and move west by afternoon, because stopping meant falling behind the season and missing the Sierra passes before snow closed them, which meant dying of a different cause in a different place. The diaries of 1840. 9 are full of these entries, a brief notation of a death, sometimes a name, sometimes only the bare fact of it, and then an immediate return to the practical details of travel, as if the writer understood that dwelling on the loss was a luxury the trail did not permit. The animals that pulled the wagons were the journey's limiting factor in ways that their human owners sometimes failed to fully appreciate until the animals began to die. An ox team that left Missouri in good condition in late April would reach the Nevada desert in August, having lost significant body weight. Its feet worn by months of rocky terrain, its strength diminished by sustained exertion on a diet of whatever grass could be found along the route. When the grass gave out in the desert, the animals gave out with it, and a wagon without draft animals was a collection of wood and canvas that its former owners had to abandon and continue on foot. Men carried what they could on their backs across the Nevada desert and the Sierra Nevada passes, arriving in California with their original ambitions largely intact and their original possessions largely distributed across 2,000 miles of trail. The letters that 40 Niners sent home from California, and the letters that wives and mothers sent back across the continent, are among the most emotionally direct documents in the American historical record. The 40 Niner, writing to his wife from a mining camp, was navigating between two competing obligations. The obligation to honesty toward someone he loved, and the obligation to justify the decision he had made and the separation he had imposed. The result was a specific kind of carefully modulated truth, genuine positives emphasized, genuine negatives acknowledged but minimized. The overall tone calibrated to convey that the sacrifice was worthwhile without quite being able to prove it yet. The wife writing back was navigating her own version of the same tension, managing children and farm and finances alone, reporting difficulties without making them sound insurmountable, maintaining the connection across 2,000 miles of silence with the only tool available, which was words on paper carried by a postal system that took weeks to deliver them and frequently lost them entirely. The world that the 40 Niners arrived in was not the world they had been imagining during the months of preparation and the months of travel. The California of the imagination, the California assembled from newspaper reports and promotional pamphlets and the breathless letters of early arrivals, was a place where gold lay in the riverbeds for the taking, where any man willing to get his feet wet and his hands dirty could make a fortune in a season and return home transformed. The California that actually existed was more complicated, more physically demanding, more socially volatile, and more economically unequal than anything the promotional material had suggested. The transformation from imagined California to actual California was one of the gold rush's most consistent experiences, and the letters that miners sent home in the first weeks after their arrival trace that transformation with a frankness that their authors, needing to justify the decision they had made and the families they had left behind, sometimes struggled to maintain. And yet the gold was real. That was the thing that sustained the rush through its most punishing periods, and that makes it permanently different from the fraudulent land schemes and hollow promises that peppered American economic history before and after. The American River and the other streams draining the western slope of the Sierra Nevada did contain placer gold, free gold, gold eroded from ancient quartz veins by millennia of water and deposited in the gravel of riverbeds in quantities that genuinely could make a man wealthy if he arrived early enough, worked hard enough, and possessed the specific combination of skill and luck that the diggings rewarded. The accounts of the earliest miners, the men who were working the streams in 1840, 8 before the news had spread beyond California, describe a reality that matched the imagination closely enough to feed the legend for generations. Miners in the summer of 1840, 8 were pulling multiple ounces a day from the gravel bars of American River tributaries, working with equipment so simple that the sophistication of the effort was invisible. In a landscape where nuggets genuinely were found among overturned rocks and gold dust, genuinely did accumulate in the crevices of bedrock with a generosity that seemed almost intentional. By 1849, when the Great Migration arrived after its months of overland or maritime travel, the easiest gold was largely gone. Not all the gold. There was still a great deal of it. And men were making genuine fortunes well into the early 1850s. But the low, hanging fruit of the 48 season had been claimed by the men who were already there. And the 49ers found a landscape of worked, over gravel bars, established claims, and a social organization of mining camps that had developed with remarkable speed in the complete absence of any formal law or government. The tools of placer mining were simple enough that their simplicity was itself part of what made the gold rush's early years genuinely democratic in a way that later industrial mining would not be. A pan, broad, shallow, iron, capable of being swirled in a circular motion that allowed water and gravel to wash over the rim while the heavier gold settled to the bottom, cost a few dollars and required no special knowledge to acquire, though using it with real efficiency required a feel for the material that only practice could develop. The cradle, or rocker, was the next step up in productivity, a wooden box with a perforated bottom mounted on curved rockers into which gravel was shoveled and water poured while the cradle rocked back and forth, the gold settling through the perforations while lighter material washed away. The sluice box extended this principle further, a long trough through which water ran continuously, gravel shoveled in at the top and the current carrying lighter material downstream, while gold accumulated behind wooden riffles on the floor. Each tool represented a marginal improvement in efficiency. Each was within the reach of an individual or a small partnership to build or purchase, and each reflected the essential character of the gold rush's first phase as a technology of personal effort applied to a common resource. The specific physics underlying all of it was straightforward. Gold is approximately 19 times heavier than water and more than 6 times heavier than most of the rock and gravel with which it occurs, meaning that any process separating materials by density will tend to concentrate gold at the bottom of whatever container or channel is being used. Gold stays where the water leaves it. It accumulates in the bends of rivers where the current slows, in bedrock crevices where lighter materials are continuously swept away, in gravel bars below rapids where turbulence drops its load. Learning to read a river for gold, to look at its shape and current and underlying geology, and predict where the metal would have concentrated over thousands of years, was a skill that some men possessed and many did not. And it made the difference between the miners who consistently found colour and the much larger number who spent their days standing in cold water for wages that barely covered their food and their equipment costs. The daily life of the mining camps was simultaneously monotonous and anarchic, and the combination produced a social environment unlike anything most participants had previously experienced. The camps were organised around practical necessity, access to water, proximity to the claim, shelter from the elements, rather than around any social or aesthetic consideration, and they had the specific character of places built quickly by people who expected to be somewhere else within a year. Tents gave way to wooden shacks as permanence began to seem less temporary. Wooden shacks became permanent buildings as enough men decided that California was home. Some of those buildings eventually became the main streets of towns that still exist today, their Victorian commercial fronts preserved as tourist attractions on the highway named, with appropriate historical self-awareness. For the 40 Niners themselves, the food of the mining camps was one of the experiences that most consistently appalled men who had grown up in households where meals were varied and freshly prepared. Salt pork, beans, and sourdough bread prepared by whoever in the partnership had the least objection to cooking, consumed without ceremony in the intervals between working, constituted the baseline of camp nutrition. Fresh vegetables were a luxury so expensive in the early years that scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency disease that the absence of fresh produce produces, was a genuine medical problem in the diggings, treated when possible by dried apples and lime juice, and the specific folk knowledge that certain wild plants could substitute for citrus in providing the necessary nutrition. The economics of the camps were, from relatively early in the rush, the economics of a seller's market for everything except gold itself. A barrel of flour that cost $16 in San Francisco before the rush cost $800 at its peak. Eggs cost $1 each. Boots that would have sold for $3 on the eastern seaboard cost $100 in the mining camps. A meal of beans and salt pork and coffee at a camp restaurant cost $1.50 at a time when an average eastern factory worker earned perhaps $1 for an entire day's labor. The men making genuine fortunes from the gold rush were not, for the most part, the miners. They were the merchants who supplied them, the teamsters who transported goods to the camps, the laundresses who washed the miners' clothes, the boarding, house operators who provided beds and meals, the lawyers who adjudicated the property disputes that the absence of clear title law generated in endless and profitable variety. Samuel Brannan's lesson that the safest way to profit from a gold rush is to sell supplies to the miners rather than mine for gold yourself, was one that California's commercial class had absorbed quickly and applied with a creativity that the promotional literature had entirely failed to mention. Because selling beans to desperate men at 8 times their eastern price was not the heroic narrative that anyone was trying to tell about California in the spring of 1840. 9. The standard American narrative of the gold rush has always centered on the 40 Niner as a specifically American figure, a young man from Ohio or Pennsylvania or Missouri, restless and ambitious, drawn west by the promise of sudden wealth and the cultural permission of manifest destiny. That figure is real, and his experience is genuinely central to the story, but it is only one thread in a fabric far more complex and far more global than the standard narrative has traditionally acknowledged. The 40 Niners were not exclusively American. They were not even primarily American in many of the mining districts, particularly in the southern mines where the concentration of Latin American, Chinese, and European migrants created communities that looked less like frontier America and more like something entirely without precedent in the history of the world. The gold rush was a global event from its earliest stages, attracting migrants from Chile and Peru and Mexico who arrived by sea within months of the discovery. From China and Hawaii through the Pacific trade networks that had been connecting the Pacific Rim for decades. From Australia and New Zealand, whose maritime proximity to California made the journey shorter than the overland route from Missouri. From France and Germany and Britain and Ireland and the Cape Colony and South Africa. From the ports of every ocean, facing civilization that had the ships to make the passage and the information networks to learn that gold was waiting on the other side of whatever ocean separated them from California. By 1850, the mining camps of the Sierra Nevada foothills contained men who had traveled from perhaps 30 different countries, speaking 15 different languages, practicing a dozen different religions, bringing with them the accumulated mining techniques of every gold, producing region on Earth, and the cultural assumptions and racial hierarchies and social conflicts of every society they had left behind. What assembled in the California foothills in those years was something genuinely new in human history. A community formed not by shared origin or shared culture or shared language, but by shared desire, and held together by nothing more durable than proximity and the hope of gold. It was the most cosmopolitan place on earth in the early 1850s, and simultaneously one of the most dangerous. And the connection between those two facts is not coincidental. The first targets of organized exclusion were the Latin American miners, primarily from Chile and Mexico, who had arrived earliest and in the largest numbers among the foreign-born populations, and who brought with them mining techniques developed across generations of working the silver and gold deposits of their home countries. These techniques were often more sophisticated than anything the American 49ers possessed. Chilean miners in particular arrived with knowledge of placer operations and hard rock extraction that their American counterparts were still learning by trial and error, and their early productivity in the southern mines generated a resentment that had less to do with their methods than with their success. The California Foreign Miners Tax of 1850, the first of several such laws, levied a monthly fee of $20 on all foreign-born miners, a sum representing approximately half a month's earnings for a successful miner at that period's gold prices, and that was explicitly designed to drive foreign competition out of the most productive districts. The law did not distinguish between nationalities in its text, but was enforced primarily against Latin American and Chinese miners by the Anglo-American mining communities who controlled the camps and their informal legal mechanisms. Its immediate effect was to drive a significant portion of the Latin American mining population either back to their home countries or into the less remunerative service economy of the camps, where their labor could be exploited without the inconvenience of them competing for the same gold. The deeper effect was to establish a template for racial exclusion in California that subsequent legislation would refine and extend with increasing legal sophistication over the following decades, culminating in restrictions and exclusions that reshaped not only California, but the entire framework of American immigration law. The Chinese miners who began arriving in California in 1849, and whose numbers grew rapidly through the early 1850s, occupied a position in the gold rush's social order that combined economic indispensability with systematic social contempt in proportions that varied by location and period, but that consistently resolved against the Chinese when conflict arose. They came primarily from the Pearl River Delta region of Guangdong province in southern China, driven by the combination of economic devastation from the Taiping Rebellion and the specific information networks that connected the Pearl River Delta to the California gold fields through the maritime trade routes of the Pacific. They called California Gamsan, Gold Mountain, and the men who went there typically understood the migration in terms of the sojourner model that shaped Chinese labor migration throughout the Pacific world. Go, earn, return, make enough in California to establish a secure life at home, then come back. What they found in California was a society that wanted their labor and despised their presence with a consistency that made the sojourner model both emotionally logical and practically difficult to execute. By 1850, approximately 25,000 Chinese were living in California, making them the largest non-Anglo-ethnic group in the state. Chinese miners were excluded from the best claims by the informal organization of mining camp society, pushed systematically to the worked, over ground that American miners had already processed and abandoned, taxed at disproportionate rates under the foreign miners' tax that was renewed and specifically targeted at them after its initial application had driven most Latin American miners away, subjected to violence that the legal system rarely prosecuted, and denied the right to testify in court against white defendants under a California Supreme Court ruling of 1850. 4. That extended to Chinese miners a legal disability originally established to exclude indigenous testimony. Despite these conditions, or perhaps partly because of them, since necessity is a powerful teacher, Chinese miners were remarkably productive. Their patience and their willingness to work marginal claims that others had dismissed, combined with placer techniques developed over centuries of Chinese gold mining experience, allowed them to extract gold from gravels that American methods had missed. They were a significant economic force in the California mining economy throughout the 1850s, and their contribution to the state's gold production was systematically undervalued, precisely because acknowledging it would have complicated the narrative of their inferiority that the exclusion policies required. The Chinese also constituted the majority of the labor force that built the western section of the Transcontinental Railroad through the 1860s. Carrying the brutal work of blasting and grading through the Sierra Nevada on their backs in conditions that the celebration of the railroad's completion at Promontory Summit in 1860 did not acknowledge, and that American history did not fully reckon with for another century. The migration chain that began with the gold rush proved far more permanent than most of its participants intended. The specific villages of the Pearl River Delta that sent men to California in the 1850s still have descendants in California today. The sojourner model having given way, across generations of exclusion and occasional inclusion, to something more permanent and more complicated, and ultimately more deeply woven into the fabric of California than anyone in 1840. 9. Chinese or American could possibly have anticipated. The women of the California gold rush have received less historical attention than the men, which is both demographically understandable and historically unfortunate in equal measure. Understandable because women were a genuine numerical minority in the gold rush population, perhaps 5% in the earliest years, rising gradually as the camps began to stabilize, and the prospect of permanent settlement became more real than the prospect of quick return. Unfortunate because the women who went to California were among the most remarkable individuals of a generation that produced remarkable individuals in considerable abundance, and their experience of the rush-illuminated dimensions of the event that the male-centered narrative has consistently missed, glossed over, or sentimentalized into something more comfortable than the actual record supports. They came by the same 3 routes as the men, enduring the same mud and cholera of the overland trail, the same monotony and terror of the sea voyage, the same pestilential misery of the Panama crossing, and they arrived in a society that was simultaneously desperate for their presence and deeply ambivalent about what their presence meant. A camp of men who have not experienced ordinary domestic comfort for 6 months, who have not eaten at home, cooked meal or slept in a clean bed, or heard a woman's voice in conversation since Missouri, is a community with a specific and powerful hunger that goes well beyond the desire for gold. That hunger created economic opportunities for women that were, in their own way, as dramatic and as real as the opportunities the rivers offered to men, and considerably more reliable. Since the domestic services that women provided were needed every day, regardless of what the gravel bars were yielding, the economic landscape available to women in Gold Rush, California, was extraordinary by the standards of any other place or time in the 19th century world, and the women who recognized and exploited it did so with a practicality and a resourcefulness that the period's sentimental image of femininity entirely fails to capture. A laundress in the mining camps charged $8 for a basket of washing, the same service that would have cost 50 cents in Massachusetts. She was not charging $8 because she was greedy. She was charging $8 because there was essentially no competition, because the men who needed the service had gold dust and were willing to spend it, and because she understood with perfect clarity that scarcity creates value regardless of what the service is. A boarding housekeeper who charged $1 a meal and fed 30 or 40 miners 3 times a day was running a business whose profit margins the most successful mining operations could not consistently match. Because her customers came back every day whether or not the claim was producing. The seamstress who charged $1 a button, and considerably more for more substantial work, was selling a skill so rare in the all-male camps that she could name almost any price and expect it to be paid without serious negotiation. These were not glamorous enterprises, and the promotional literature of the gold rush had not bothered to mention them, because they were work that women did, rather than the heroic adventure narrative that men dreamed about and newspaper editors found sellable. But they were genuinely profitable in ways that mining frequently was not, and the women who ran them were building something more durable than a mining claim. They were building businesses and reputations and, in some cases, the financial foundations of California's first generation of female economic independence. The letters and diaries that women left from the gold rush years constitute some of the most vivid and irreplaceable documents of the entire experience. And none more so than the letters of Louise Clapp, a physician's wife who accompanied her husband to the northern mines and wrote under the pen name Dame Shirley a series of 23 letters to her sister back east that were eventually published in the Pioneer magazine of San Francisco. Clapp was a writer of genuine and unusual talent. Funny, observant, physically specific, unromantic about the violence and the hardship without being unable to see the genuine wildness and colour of the world she was inhabiting. Her descriptions of the mining camps capture what no male diarist quite managed to capture: the texture of the social environment as a whole, rather than just the mechanics of the mining operation. The mud and the noise and the constant overlapping sound of Spanish and French and Chinese and various American dialects, all being spoken simultaneously within earshot. The extraordinary food prices and the extraordinary willingness to pay them. The specific social dynamics of a community of men who had left everything familiar behind and were improvising a civilization from scratch, with the specific combination of energy and awkwardness and occasional genuine grace that improvised civilizations tend to produce. Her account of witnessing a miner's court, a lynching, and a drunken holiday celebration in the same week, narrated with a dry precision that makes the chaos comprehensible without domesticating it, remains the finest single literary document of the gold rush from any perspective. The women who worked in the mining camps as prostitutes occupied a position in the gold rush economy that was economically central and socially marginalized in ways that the period's moral categories made difficult to discuss honestly, and that subsequent historical treatment has swung between prurient sensationalism and embarrassed silence without settling into the honest reckoning the subject deserves. They were there from the earliest days of the rush, drawn by the same economic logic that drew everyone else to California, the understanding that wherever large numbers of men with money and limited options congregated, certain services would be in high demand and would command high prices. The establishments in which they worked ranged from the rough cribs lining the back streets of mining towns to the more elaborate parlor houses of San Francisco that catered to the wealthier and more socially aspirational end of the market. Many were not in California by free choice. The specific mechanisms by which women ended up in mining camp prostitution range from economic desperation through various degrees of social coercion to the outright trafficking that was documented most extensively in the Chinese community, where women were sometimes brought from China under debt bondage arrangements that bore no relationship to voluntary labor migration, and that created conditions of captivity as complete as formal slavery. The moral panic about Chinese prostitution that became one of the contributing rhetorical factors to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1880, too, was not entirely without factual foundation. Trafficking of Chinese women to California was real and documented by contemporaries with enough consistency to be taken seriously, but it was deployed with a hypocrisy that ignored the coercive circumstances surrounding much non-Chinese sex work in the camps, and that used the genuine problem of trafficking as a convenient cover for a broader project of Chinese exclusion, whose real motivations had more to do with labor competition than with any sincere concern for the welfare of trafficked women. California offered women in the gold rush years something genuinely unprecedented, a space where the normal rules governing female economic activity had been suspended by the sheer pressure of demand, where a woman with practical skills and the willingness to apply them in difficult conditions could earn in a week what would have taken months in the settled East. That opportunity came wrapped in danger and isolation and the specific social vulnerability of being a woman in a community designed by and for men. The women who navigated it successfully did so through a combination of practical intelligence, physical toughness, and the specific adaptability that the gold rush demanded of everyone. It did not break entirely. There is a version of the California gold rush story that moves efficiently from discovery to migration to mining camp culture to statehood, without pausing long enough on the question of what happened to the people who were already in California when the 49ers arrived. That version is not a lie exactly. Everything in it may be accurate as far as it goes, but its omissions are so consequential that they constitute a fundamental distortion of the historical record. The people who were already there experienced the gold rush not as an adventure or an opportunity or even a disruption, but as a catastrophe of the first order, delivered with a speed and a totality that overwhelmed every capacity for adaptation or resistance that communities with thousands of years of California experience had developed. In 1840, approximately 150,000 Indigenous Californians were alive. By 1860, after 12 years of American territorial expansion and gold rush settlement, the indigenous population of California had fallen to approximately 30,000 people. By 1900, it would fall further still, to perhaps 15,000. The destruction of nearly 9/10 of California's indigenous population in the second half of the 19th century was not primarily the result of disease. Though disease played a role, it was primarily the result of deliberate violence, of killings and massacres, and the specific policies of extermination that the California state government enacted, funded, and in some cases celebrated with a legal formality and a political transparency that makes the word genocide not a rhetorical flourish, but the accurate descriptive term for what occurred. The miners who poured into the Sierra Nevada foothills in 1840, 9 and 1850 were occupying the homeland of the Maidu, the Miwok, the Nisenan, the Yokuts, and dozens of other indigenous nations whose communities had been using those rivers and oak woodlands for thousands of years. The specific resources that the gold seekers were extracting, the rivers themselves, the gravel beds, the water, were the same resources that indigenous communities depended upon for their food and their livelihood. Every pan of gravel processed, every stream diverted, every hillside stripped was an act of dispossession, regardless of whether the miner performing it understood it in those terms, which most did not. The violence was not incidental to the gold rush. It was organized, encouraged, and funded by the political culture of American California from its earliest institutional expressions. Peter Burnett, the first elected governor of California, told the state legislature in January 1850, one, that a war of extermination would continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race became extinct. He was not describing something he regretted or something he was powerless to prevent. He was describing something he was committed to facilitating. And the legislature he was addressing responded with a consistency that left no ambiguity about the state's intentions. The California legislature appropriated $1.5 million, an enormous sum for a state that had been formally organized for less than a year, to fund military expeditions against indigenous communities in the first 2 years of statehood alone. The expeditions that this money financed killed indigenous people in numbers that participants sometimes recorded and sometimes deliberately did not. In massacres at Clear Lake and Bloody Island and dozens of other sites whose names local indigenous memory preserved long after the state's official history chose to forget them. The bounty system that some California counties operated, paying for indigenous scalps and severed heads as proof of kills, was an incentive structure as explicit as anything in the historical record of organized mass killing, creating a market for murder that required no further ideological justification than the price list posted at the county office. The hydraulic mining that replaced placer operations in the early 1850s delivered its own form of environmental destruction to indigenous communities, whose relationship with the land was inseparable from their physical and cultural survival. The enormous monitors that blasted entire hillsides into slurry destroyed the watersheds and silted the rivers to a degree that eliminated the salmon runs, which were the dietary foundation of the foothill peoples. The oak woodlands that produced the acorns that constituted the staple food of many California indigenous groups were cleared for mining operations and firewood, and the timber demands of rapidly growing settlements. The game that indigenous communities had hunted sustainably for generations was shot out by miners who needed meat and who had neither knowledge of nor interest in the sustainable harvest practices that had maintained those animal populations across centuries. The people whose food systems the gold rush destroyed did not have alternative food systems to fall back on. They had the food system that California's specific ecology had provided, and that California's indigenous communities had spent thousands of years learning to use with extraordinary sophistication. Remove it, and you remove the material basis for survival. The Mexican Californians, the ranchero families who had constituted the dominant social and economic class of Mexican California, experienced the gold rush as a different kind of catastrophe. Less immediately physical, but equally total in its ultimate effect on their position and their prospects. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had explicitly guaranteed the property rights of Mexican citizens who chose to remain in American California, a guarantee that represented the legal foundation on which the ranchero families based their reasonable expectation that the transfer of sovereignty would not mean the transfer of their land. The California Land Act of 1850. One created a commission to adjudicate the validity of Spanish and Mexican land grants, a mechanism that sounded in theory like the institutional fulfillment of the treaty's promise and that proved in practice to be one of the most effective instruments of dispossession in the history of American land law. Every claimant was required to present their case before the commission within 2 years, producing original documents that had often been imprecisely drafted in the casual administrative culture of the Rancho period, proving continuous occupation and use of boundaries that had been defined by landmarks. That tree, that creek bend, that distinctive rock formation, rather than by surveyed coordinates. The legal costs of pursuing a claim through the commission and through the years of litigation that most claims then required in federal court were beyond the resources of most ranchero families, who had been land, rich in cash, poor before the gold rush, and whose financial position had deteriorated rapidly as the labour force that had run their operations dispersed to the gold fields and the cattle market that had sustained their economy collapsed under competition from American agricultural imports arriving by ship. Lawyers who understood the commission process charged fees that consumed the income from the very land whose title was being defended, creating a financial spiral that foreclosure and squatter pressure then completed. By the 1860s, the great majority of the vast ranchos of Mexican California were in American hands, transferred through a legal process that was technically legitimate in its procedures and systematically unjust in its outcomes, a dispossession accomplished not with guns, but with filing deadlines and legal fees and the patient pressure of a hungry population that surrounded the ranchero families on every side and waited for the inevitable. The Californios, who had welcomed some American arrivals and traded with others and intermarried with a few, found that the Americanization of California was not the multicultural accommodation they might reasonably have expected from a treaty that promised to protect them, but a displacement so thorough that within a generation the families whose names still mark California's geography, its ranchos, its streets, its counties, had been reduced from the aristocracy of the territory to a dispossessed minority in the state their ancestors had shaped. The gold rush did not cause this dispossession. Its roots ran deeper, into the structure of American land hunger and racial hierarchy that preceded 1840. But it accelerated the process with a thoroughness that the slower pace of ordinary settlement would never have achieved, compressing into a decade what might otherwise have taken a generation, and leaving too little time for the legal and political accommodations that a slower transition might conceivably have produced. San Francisco's transformation during the gold rush years was one of the most spectacular episodes of urban growth in the recorded history of human settlement, and it was produced not by planning or intention but by the ruthless logic of geography, operating on an economy moving at a speed that no institution could fully anticipate or control. The small settlement at the tip of the San Francisco Peninsula, 900 people in the early months of 1840. A collection of adobe buildings and canvas tents clustered around a natural harbour that most of the world had not yet heard of, was transformed by the simple fact of its location into the commercial capital of the gold rush as inevitably as water finds the lowest available channel. The Bay of San Francisco was the finest natural harbour on the Pacific coast of North America, deep enough for ocean-going vessels, protected enough to be navigable in almost any weather, positioned at the mouth of the Sacramento and San Joaquin river systems that drained the entire Central Valley and the Sierra Nevada foothills where the gold was. Almost everything that came to California by sea had to pass through the Golden Gate. Almost everything produced in the mining regions that needed to reach the wider world passed outward through the same narrow strait. The city that grew to manage those flows grew with the specific character of the economy it was serving. Fast, improvisational, spectacularly expensive, simultaneously creative and chaotic, prone to disaster, and equally prone to the rapid recovery that a community convinced of its own indispensability tends to demonstrate. By 1850, San Francisco had 5,000 residents. By 1852, the number was closer to 5,000, with a commercial infrastructure, banks, warehouses, insurance companies, import firms, newspapers, hotels, restaurants, theatres, and gambling establishments that had been constructed in a matter of months by people who understood that gold was flowing through California and that the way to capture the maximum share of it was to position yourself between the gold and everything the miners needed to buy. The city burned 6 times in 18 months between December 1849 and June 1850. And the fires tell you almost everything important about what San Francisco was in those years. The primary construction materials of a city growing faster than permanent structures could be erected were canvas and wood. Canvas tents that went up in hours and wooden frame buildings that went up in days, neither of which offered any meaningful resistance to fire once it started moving through a neighborhood on the wind that swept regularly off the bay. The first fire, in December 1849, destroyed a block of buildings on the central waterfront. The second, in May 1850, consumed 3 or 4 blocks. Each subsequent fire was larger than the last as the city grew faster than its firefighting capacity. The 6th fire, in June 1850, was the most devastating, burning approximately 2,000 buildings and causing property losses estimated at several $1 million at a time, when $1 million represented an almost incomprehensible quantity of wealth. After each fire, the city rebuilt, typically within weeks, with the specific energy of a community that understood itself to be sitting on top of one of the greatest economic opportunities in the history of the world, and was not prepared to let the temporary inconvenience of losing everything it owned slow it down for long. The rebuilding after each successive fire was in slightly more permanent materials than what had burned. Canvas replaced by wood replaced by brick, so that the fires served an inadvertent but genuine function as accelerants of permanence. Each disaster pushing the city one step further toward the durable urban form that its commercial ambitions required. Walking through the blocks of San Francisco that survived subsequent earthquakes and fires, you are walking through a city whose material character was shaped as much by what burned as by what was intentionally built. The social culture of Gold Rush San Francisco was in its earliest years almost entirely male and almost entirely oriented toward the specific pleasures that men with gold dust and no domestic responsibilities tend to pursue when left to mow. Their own organizational devices. The gambling establishments that lined Portsmouth Square operated around the clock, offering faro and monte and poker at tables, where the stakes were denominated in gold dust that miners poured from leather pouches onto the felt, with a casualness that sometimes reflected genuine abundance and sometimes reflected the specific psychological state of a person who has been poor long, enough that money has lost its reality as a limiting factor. The bars, called saloons or banking houses or various other euphemisms, that revealed the period's interesting relationship between commerce and vice, served the extraordinary quantities of alcohol that Gold Rush California consumed at rates per capita that would alarm any modern public health authority, and that the period accepted as a reasonable response to the specific stresses of frontier life. The theatrical performances and concerts and circus acts that competed for the disposable income of the mining community ranged from the genuinely accomplished to the frankly eccentric in a cultural environment willing to pay high prices for almost any form of entertainment simply because entertainment was scarce and gold dust was relatively plentiful. The Barbary Coast district that developed along San Francisco's waterfront in the early 1850s became within a decade one of the most notorious concentrations of vice in the world. A dense zone of saloons, dance halls, gambling parlours, and brothels whose reputation for violence and exploitation drew investigative journalists, reform crusaders, and curious tourists in approximately equal numbers across the subsequent decades. The specific institutional innovation that the gold rush produced with perhaps the most surprising durability was denim. Levi Strauss, a Bavarian Jewish immigrant who arrived in San Francisco in 1850, with a stock of dry goods he intended to sell to the mining camps, recognized that the demand for durable work clothing was essentially unlimited in a population, spending its days in physical labor that destroyed ordinary fabric at remarkable speed. The canvas and later denim trousers he began producing, reinforced with copper rivets at the stress points that tended to tear under the specific demands of placer mining, bending, crouching, kneeling in water, dragging heavy equipment, were exactly what the miners required and could not find in adequate supply. The Levi Strauss company that emerged from this observation has never stopped making jeans. The blue denim jean that has become perhaps the most globally ubiquitous garment in human history is a direct and unbroken descendant of the California gold rush. The physical embodiment of the intersection between the need for durable working clothes and the specific physical demands of standing in a Sierra Nevada river in 1850 looking for gold. There is something simultaneously fitting and genuinely absurd about the fact that the most enduring material legacy of one of the most consequential events in American history is a pair of pants. The Vigilance Committees of 1850, 1 and 1850, 6 were the gold rush's most dramatic expression of the perpetual tension between the need for social order and the inadequacy of formal legal institutions to provide it at the speed that a rapidly growing commercial city required. The 1850. One committee organized in response to a wave of crime attributed primarily, in the narrative that the committee's supporters promoted most aggressively, to Australian convicts known as Sydney Ducks, who had arrived with the gold rush migration and were alleged to be responsible for a disproportionate share of the fires and robberies that plagued the city. The committee hanged 4 men, flogged 1, and deported 20, 8 before disbanding, having demonstrated with considerable clarity that the commercial class of San Francisco was willing to exercise extra-legal violence when the formal legal system appeared to be producing inadequate results. The 1850. 6 Committee, organized in response to the murder of a reform newspaper editor by a political operative connected to the Democratic Party machine that dominated San Francisco politics, was larger, better organized, and more explicitly political in its targets, hanging 2 men and forcing the effective resignation of the political machine that had been running the city's patronage networks. Both episodes were simultaneously genuine responses to real problems of public order and convenient instruments for the elimination of political opponents and the assertion of commercial class dominance over a city whose rapid growth had produced a political culture that the merchant establishment found insufficiently responsive to its interests. The political story of California's entry into the United States is inseparable from the story of slavery, and the gold rush's acceleration of California's development forced a political crisis whose implications reach so far beyond California itself that understanding the gold rush without understanding its role in the countdown to the Civil War is like understanding a fuse without understanding the explosive it was attached to, the Mexican. American War had acquired an enormous tract of territory from Mexico, and the question of whether slavery would be permitted in that territory had been asked from the moment the first congressional debate about the war's objectives began. It was a question the existing political system was structurally incapable of answering cleanly, because the answer required one section of the country to accept a permanent diminishment of its political power, and no political system in the history of the world has ever found a reliable mechanism for persuading powerful people to voluntarily accept permanent diminishment. James K. Polk's announcement of the gold discovery in December 1840. 8 made the question suddenly and urgently practical in a way that the preceding months of theoretical debate had not. California was filling with people at a rate that made territorial status a temporary condition rather than a permanent arrangement, and the question of what kind of state it would become, free or slave, was no longer an abstract matter of future policy, but an immediate political emergency requiring resolution within months rather than years. The California Constitutional Convention that met in Monterey in September 1849 brought together 48 delegates, the majority of them recent arrivals with almost no familiarity with California's history or population, operating under no clear legal authority from Congress, and yet producing a document that would shape the political crisis of the following decade, with consequences none of them fully anticipated. The prohibition of slavery that the California Constitution contained was not, it is important to understand, primarily an expression of abolitionist moral conviction. Though some delegates did hold genuine abolitionist views that deserve acknowledgement, it was primarily a practical calculation made by men who understood the California mining economy and who recognized with clarity that slave labor in the gold fields would undercut the wages of free miners in ways that the white 49er population would not tolerate. The free labor politics of the mining community had already demonstrated their character in the foreign miners' tax and in the organized exclusion of Latin American and Chinese miners from the best claims. That same labor market anxiety extended readily and naturally to the prospect of enslaved workers competing for the same gold, owned by wealthy southern planters who could absorb losses that individual free miners could not. The white 49ers who opposed slavery in California were not, in the main, men who believed in racial equality or who would have extended the rights of citizenship to the people whose labor they were protecting their own wages against. They were men who understood that their economic position in California depended on the absence of a labor system that would systematically disadvantage them, and they wrote that understanding into the state constitution with the directness that practical men bring to practical problems. The moral argument against slavery and the economic argument against slave labor arrived at the same constitutional provision through entirely different routes, and the historical tendency to credit the former while overlooking the latter produces a more flattering but less accurate account of the convention's motivations. California's application for admission to the Union as a free state in 1850 arrived in Washington like a geological event, something that had been building beneath the surface for years and that now expressed itself with a force that the existing political structures were not designed to absorb. There were at that moment 15 slave states and 15 free states in the Union, giving each section exactly equal representation in the Senate and therefore equal capacity to block legislation hostile to its fundamental interests. Adding California as a free state without simultaneously admitting a slave state would permanently break that balance, giving the free states a Senate majority that the slave-holding South could never subsequently overcome through normal political processes. Southern senators responded to California's application with a combination of fury and threat that left no ambiguity about the stakes as they understood them. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, already dying but present in the Senate chamber to hear his prepared speech read by a colleague because he lacked the physical strength to deliver it himself, argued that the admission of California as a free state would make the South's position within the Union untenable. He was not engaging in rhetorical exaggeration. He was describing, with the specific analytical clarity that made him the most formidable defender of the slave-holding interest in American political history, the mathematical reality of what California's admission would mean for Southern power in the federal government. The Compromise of 1850 that Henry Clay engineered and Daniel Webster defended and a dying Calhoun opposed was a legislative package of extraordinary complexity whose individual provisions were designed to offer something to each section while resolving nothing fundamental about the conflict that had generated the crisis. California was admitted as a free state. This was the provision that mattered most immediately, and that the South accepted as the price of the other concessions the compromise contained. The rest of the territory acquired from Mexico was organized without explicit mention of slavery, leaving the question to be resolved by the settlers themselves under the doctrine of popular sovereignty that Stephen Douglas championed as a democratic solution and that its critics recognized immediately as a mechanism for endless conflict rather than resolution. A new and substantially more stringent Fugitive Slave Act replaced the largely unenforced version of 1890. 3. Requiring northern states to actively assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people, and creating a legal obligation that northern public opinion found increasingly intolerable as the decade progressed. The compromise bought approximately 10 years, enough time for the railroad and the telegraph to bind California more firmly to the northern economic system, enough time for the Republican Party to emerge from the wreckage of the Whigs and the Free Soilers as the political vehicle of northern free labor ideology, enough time for the conflict that the compromise had deferred to accumulate the additional energy that the Kansas, Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry would supply before the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 triggered the secession that the compromise had been designed to prevent. The individual lives that the gold rush brought to California illuminate the political story from the inside in ways that the legislative history cannot. Biddy Mason arrived in California in 1850. One as an enslaved woman, brought by her enslaver Robert Smith from Georgia through Utah to California, where she was legally free under the state constitution, but where Smith had no intention of acknowledging that legal reality. Her petition for freedom, filed in the Los Angeles courts in 1850. 6. Required a specific and remarkable courage. The courage of a person who is legally property challenging her enslaver in a legal system whose application to people in her position was inconsistent at best and hostile at worst. She won. She became free at 30, 8 years of age, worked as a midwife and nurse with a discipline and an intelligence that her enslaver had never been able to suppress. Saved her earnings with the specific intentionality of someone who understood that economic security was the only foundation on which the freedom she had legally acquired could be made real and permanent. She bought land in what is now downtown Los Angeles in 1860. 6. Continued acquiring property as the city grew around her investments, and spent the latter decades of her life providing charitable support to the poor of Los Angeles regardless of their race or origin. When she died in 1890, 1. Her estate was valued at $300,000, a figure that represented not only a remarkable personal achievement, but a specific and pointed refutation of every assumption about capacity and potential that the institution of slavery had required its defenders to maintain. John Bidwell, who had been among the first overland immigrants to California in 1840, 1. And who was working for Sutter when Marshall made his discovery, established his own mining claim on a Feather River tributary, made enough to purchase Rancho Chico in the Sacramento Valley, and spent the subsequent decades becoming one of California's most prominent citizens, congressman, temperance advocate, presidential candidate for the Prohibition Party in 1890. 2. His trajectory from Carpenter's neighbor at the moment of discovery to established California landowner to national political figure traced the arc that the gold rush made possible at its most optimistic, the complete reinvention of a life through the specific opportunities that a new place in a formative moment provided to those with the combination of ability and fortune to seize them. The gold rush ended, or rather it transformed, because there is no clean date on which the California mining economy simply stopped and something else began in its place. The placer gold of the riverbeds was largely exhausted by the mid-1850s, not entirely, but sufficiently that the marginal returns of individual placer mining had dropped below the level that could sustain the optimism that had driven the original migration. What replaced it was hydraulic mining, and hydraulic mining was one of those technological innovations that is genuinely extraordinary in its efficiency and genuinely catastrophic in its side effects. A combination that the 19th century was constitutionally disinclined to treat as a problem, because the conceptual framework for thinking about environmental destruction as a category of harm requiring regulation had not yet been assembled into anything with political force. The principle of hydraulic mining was straightforward and its scale was not. A monitor nozzle capable of projecting an enormous stream of water at pressures sufficient to erode solid hillside was directed at slopes containing gold, bearing gravel and left to do the work that individual miners with pans and sluice boxes had done one painful shovelful at a time. An entire hillside, the accumulated geological work of millions of years, could be dissolved into slurry within days. The resulting mixture of water and gravel and clay was run through extended sluice systems to catch the gold and then discharged into the nearest convenient watercourse as tailings, carrying the debris of demolished hillsides into the river systems of the Sacramento Valley with a consistency and a volume that navigation surveys began documenting with increasing alarm almost from the beginning of hydraulic operations. The Sierra Nevada foothills were visibly scarred within years of hydraulic mining's introduction. Vast areas of hillside reduced to bare orange and white clay. The original soil and vegetation stripped away. The exposed mineral subsoil baking in the California sun in a sterility that would take generations to begin recovering. The rivers that carried the tailings filled with sediment to depths that altered their channels, raised their banks, extended their deltas into San Francisco Bay, and delivered to the Sacramento Valley farmers downstream a slow, motion catastrophe of buried fields and unpredictable flooding that transformed the environmental question from an abstract concern into a concrete economic grievance with legal standing. Sacramento itself, sitting on the floodplain of the American River, experienced floods of increasing severity as the river's bed rose with accumulated hydraulic debris, requiring the city to eventually raise its entire street level by several feet, which is why walking through the underground passages of old Sacramento today means walking through what were once the ground floors of 1850s buildings, now buried beneath the raised street level that hydraulic mining's legacy required. The legal response to hydraulic mining's environmental destruction was the Sawyer decision of 1880. 4. A federal injunction against the discharge of hydraulic mining debris into the navigable waterways of the Sacramento Valley that effectively ended large-scale hydraulic operations in California. It was, in outcome, if not in stated intention, one of the first significant pieces of environmental regulation in American history, and it was produced not by concern for the environment in any recognizable modern sense, but by the collision of two sets of economic interests in which the downstream farmers had organized, litigated persistently, and eventually prevailed over the upstream mining corporations in a federal court whose judge understood that the navigable waterways argument gave him the legal authority to act where a more abstract environmental harm argument might not have. The decision illustrates something important about how environmental protection has typically been achieved in American legal history, not through the assertion of nature's inherent value or even through straightforward public health arguments, but through the identification of concrete economic harm to parties with sufficient political and legal resources to pursue it to judgment. The fates of the two men most directly associated with the gold rush's origin serve as a specific and somewhat melancholy coda to the story of what the rush actually delivered to the individuals at its centre. James Marshall, who noticed the glinting thing in the mill race on January 20, 4th, 1848, and whose name consequently appeared in every account of the gold rush ever written, spent the rest of his life drifting through California in search of employment and recognition that arrived in forms too inconsistent to sustain him. He attempted mining on his own account and failed to replicate the luck of his discovery. He tried various other occupations with similarly modest results. He occasionally traded on his fame as the discoverer of California gold for whatever small payments curiosity about him could generate from visitors and journalists. The California state legislature voted him a small pension in the 1870s that was withdrawn and withdrawn again, with an inconsistency that managed to be simultaneously inadequate and insulting. He died in 1885 in a small cabin near Coloma, not far from the spot where 7 years earlier he had changed the world, in circumstances that the world he had changed did not find it necessary to make comfortable. John Sutter fared no better in the ways that mattered most to him. The flood of miners onto his land destroyed his agricultural operations within months of the discovery. His workers deserted him for the diggings, with a unanimity that left his empire without the labour it required to function. Squatters occupied his property and then challenged his title through the California Land Commission process that had been theoretically designed to protect landowners in his position. but that proved in practice to be as effective at dispossessing them as at protecting them. He spent his final years in a Washington hotel. Petitioning Congress for compensation for losses, he attributed to the American government's failure to honor the property protections the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had promised. Congress never compensated him. He died in 1880. His fort, now a state historic park, reconstructed to something approximating its 1840s appearance. Visited by school children, learning about the discovery that made California what it is. The myth that the gold rush created has proven more durable than the mining economy that produced it, more durable than the specific fortunes it generated and destroyed, more durable in some respects than the physical landscape it transformed. The California myth, the West Coast myth, the myth of the place where the old rules do not apply and a person can remake themselves entirely from whatever materials are available, has drawn migrants from the rest of the United States and from the rest of the world continuously since 1840. 8. Through cycles of hope and disappointment and renewed hope that the 40 Niners would have recognized immediately as structurally identical to their own experience. The Dust Bowl refugees of the 1930s who loaded their families onto Route 66 in Oklahoma and headed for California's agricultural valleys were performing in the language of the Great Depression the same essential gesture as the 40 Niners who had loaded their wagons in Missouri 80 years earlier, betting everything on the possibility that California would deliver what it had promised. The aerospace workers and defense industry employees who flooded Southern California in the 1940s and 1950s, the counterculture migrants who came to San Francisco in the 1960s, the technology entrepreneurs who discovered in the Santa Clara Valley in the 1980s and 90s a landscape as rich with possibility as the 40 Niners had found in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Each successive wave was repeating the fundamental transaction of the gold rush. The exchange of a known and insufficient present for an unknown and potentially extraordinary future, conducted in the specific geography of California, because California had established itself as the place where that transaction was most reliably available. Silicon Valley's culture of the garage startup, the venture capital bet on an unproven idea, the willingness to risk everything on the possibility of extraordinary return. These are the gold rush's direct cultural inheritance. The specific California attitude toward risk and reward that the 40 Niners bequeathed to everyone who came after them. The startup founder pitching an idea to an investor on Sand Hill Road is performing in 21st century technological language, the same essential act as the 40 Niner who bought his pan and his boots and his passage to California, a bet that the opportunity is real, that the effort will be rewarded, that the journey is worth everything it costs. The American River is running tonight, cold and clear in the darkness through the foothill country where it all began. The hills above it still carry the marks of what was done to them, the hydraulic scars still visible from certain vantage points more than a century and a half after the operations that created them were shut down. The rivers still carrying more sediment than they did before the gold rush began, the old mining towns strung along Highway 40. 9. Nevada City and Grass Valley and Placerville and Sutter Creek are present today as small California communities with 19th century commercial streets and Victorian houses and local museums full of the artifacts and the stories of the rush. Sustained by a tourism economy whose visitors are drawn by exactly the myth that the 40 Niners created and that has never entirely lost its power to compel. James Marshall picked up a small glinting piece of metal from the water on a January morning in 1840. 8. And changed the world. The world he changed is the one we are living in. California with its 40 million people. The Pacific economy with its global reach. The technology industry with its gold rush ethos of the sudden fortune and the transformative bet. The American West, with its complicated inheritance of indigenous dispossession and immigrant aspiration and environmental transformation, and the specific restlessness that comes from a place always understood as the destination of the prues, desperate, and the ambitious and the dreaming. Let that settle around you now. The gold that is still in those hills, and there is still gold in those hills. patient and unhurried as it has always been, is not going anywhere. It has been there for millions of years, far longer than any human being who has ever contested it, and it will remain long after the last memory of the 40. Niners has faded from every living mind. But for now, in the long, slow turn of things, let the river carry your attention downstream toward the valley, and let the night be quiet, and let the story rest.